Study after study is showing that we will actually save so much money with this transition. And there are very few fossil fuel jobs in New York State relative to the amount of green energy jobs that will be created.
Welcome to Climate Check, Stories and Solutions for Fighting Climate Change. We are part of 350 Brooklyn, an organization that strives to counter the climate crisis through local action. We work towards a world that is just, equitable, and sustainable, and where all beings can thrive. I'm Eva Dean, she, her, your host of Climate Check. I'm a climate activist and a Brooklyn-based choreographer. On today's episode, we're discussing the Climate Jobs and Coalition campaign. Our guest is Xaver Kandler, the lead coalition organizer for New York Renews, a climate justice coalition of over 320 environmental justice, labor, and multi-issue community groups that proved pivotal in the enactment of New York's climate law. Xaver focuses on campaign strategy, coordinating statewide action, and building partnerships within and outside of the coalition. Hi, Xaver. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really happy that you're here to talk about New York Renew's Climate Jobs and Justice package. But before we get started, would you mind introducing yourself with your pronouns?
My name is Xaver Kandler. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the campaigns coordinator at New York Renews.
So what does that mean to be the campaigns coordinator for New York Renews?
So we run mostly legislative campaigns in New York State. So we have a bunch of different committees that do tons of different work around the package that you just mentioned. And I work to coordinate the different committees, provide some connective tissue between them, and then develop our campaign activities like lobby days, rallies, digital actions, things of that nature.
I'm imagining that the team is a fun team and that it's fun to develop these actions.
It really is. Because we have so many different coalition members, we have over 300 coalition members, it's just such a unique mixture of voices to be able to bring all these different perspectives and skills together can be really fun and people can get really creative.
What got you involved with the climate crisis?
My sister really was the person who first organized me into climate work. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and my sister was really activated around the fracking boom that was happening around that time. And so, she would drag me to things while I was a high schooler wanting to play soccer. And after high school, I moved to Germany. And I was working in a factory there and just had a lot of time to read and to think about, the world and what was going on. And it was at that time that I had the moment that I think a lot of us that do climate and climate justice work have, where I really realized like this was the fight of our lifetime. And that if we weren't going to do this, all the other things that I cared so much about wouldn't matter. And so I came back to the United States. And I went to school in upstate New York, and going in, I knew I was, wanted to do something around climate. And so it was there that I really both started to do a lot of my own organizing and developed a lot of the organizing skills, as well as just developed the kind of analysis that brought me from climate to climate justice. So really kind of recognizing how the climate crisis was connected to all the other systems of oppression that we have in this country and around the world. And really getting clear on the intersection, in particular, of the environmental justice movement and the more mainstream, traditionally white-led climate movement. And so that, of course, then led me to New York Renews, because New York Renews is the epitome of that intersection. We call ourselves a Climate Jobs and Justice Coalition, really embodying this intersection between good jobs, justice, especially, for the most marginalized communities, and then a livable planet.
What impacts did you have in your community with the fracking gas boom in Pennsylvania?
So I grew up in the city of Pittsburgh. So the city of Pittsburgh is actually the first city to ban fracking within its limits. So there was no fracking wells in the neighborhood I grew up in. But when you drive through Pennsylvania, and it's just really clear, and you can see the impacts across the countryside. And when I graduated from high school, my dad actually moved outside of Pittsburgh and learned that there was a fracking well only a few miles from his house. And when you would drive late at night up to where he lived, you can really see like lit up on the side of the hill, just this well. There are a lot of people who can speak to this better than I can, but just the devastation of the fracking boom and of the history of fossil fuel extraction in Pennsylvania is a really long and devastating one.
3 years ago, New York State enacted the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Can you tell us a bit about this historic act?
Yeah, I'd love to. And maybe I'll start by telling just a brief history of how we got the CLCPA, which really starts with the People's Climate March. The People's Climate March was the largest climate march of all time when it happened in 2014. But it was also really unique in the way that it brought together a lot of groups that hadn't historically worked together. So we had environmental justice groups working with large national environmental groups, unions, multi-issue community groups, faith-based groups. And after this came together, a lot of the organizers were sitting around and thinking, this was really powerful, but how do we turn this into real political power? And so there was a road trip all across New York State, groups like the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, Align New York, People's Climate Movement, and we went to 80 different cities, towns across New York State and really asked community groups, what does environmental justice and climate justice look like to you? What do you want to see in New York State? And so out of that process, we drafted points of unity, we drafted a legislative package, and we actually formalized into New York Renews. We adopted the Jemez principles for democratic organizing, and we started drafting. So we drafted the law or the bill that ended up being the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which at the time we called the Climate and Community Protection Act. And we started campaigning. And so we campaigned for 3 years, and we passed the climate law in the Assembly, but we weren't able to pass it in the Senate. In 2018, the 2018 elections actually flipped the New York State Senate. It represented this huge opportunity for us in 2019. So we were doing lobby days, big rallies, and right before the end of session, Governor Cuomo said, he went on the radio and he said, we're not going to get to climate this year. So we had this rally. We had 400 people in Albany. We had 50 people risk arrest. Some of the people in this room may have been there.
I was there, yeah. It was really something. It was one of my first marches I ever went on for climate activism. It was exhilarating.
Yeah. I mean, just thinking about it literally brings me chills. It was, I think, one of those days I'll not forget for the rest of my life. And a few days later, I remember sitting in my colleague's living room and refreshing our phones and seeing that a deal had been made and the bill language was in the system and knowing that this was going to pass. And so the climate law, it's unique really around the country in that it focuses on the entire economy. It's not just on energy generation. And it also has these really ambitious climate provisions, but it does it in a way that prioritizes environmental justice and good green jobs. And so on the environmental justice front, 35% of all of the investments in clean energy in this transition must go to what the state calls disadvantaged communities. That actually became the basis of the Biden administration's Justice 40 policy, which is looking to do the same thing nationwide. And in addition to setting these emission reduction standards, setting the goals that the state needs to meet, it also set up an infrastructure to actually be able to meet that. And so it created a group called the Climate Action Council and tons of different advisory groups, subgroups like the Climate Justice Working Group, the Just Transition Working Group, many of which our coalition members serve on. Right now, in just a few weeks, the final scoping plan, which is really the plan to get us off of fossil fuels in all sectors of the economy in New York, is going to be released after this 3-year process. And that will serve as the basis for our work going forward to really decarbonize all of New York. And a lot of the climate jobs and justice package is explicitly built to work with the scoping plan and to make sure that we meet the goals and the mandates of the climate law.
Could you share with us what the Jemez principles are?
Yeah, and before I do that, I'll say it's such a good question because I think the thing that really makes New York Renew special is not just what we're fighting for, but how we're working together. And the Jemez principles are a foundational document from the environmental justice movement. They were drafted in 1996 by environmental justice and anti-globalization leaders in Jemez, New Mexico. And there's 6 principles, and they're all aimed at setting the groundwork for how we work together. So the full name is actually the Jemez Principles for Democratic Organizing. And they really set the guidelines by which we want to operate together. And so there's something that we use in all of our coalition spaces and our committees to really set the way that we want to interact together.
So it gives all of us a chance to have input statewide. There is no upstate, downstate, just different needs and communicating what those needs are. So back to this historic New York law, let's talk about the goals of the law.
So the goals of the law are by 2050 that we are net zero carbon. And so 85% of all emissions need to be completely reduced. And then there's 15%, but only in very specific industries that are very hard to decarbonize that we can offset. It also sets benchmarks, especially around electricity generation. And it means that we're also 100% fossil fuel free generation by 2040, specifically within the electricity sector. I also mentioned the environmental justice provision around the investment mandate. It also identified or created mandatory climate and equity screens that the state agencies need to use when they're making decisions. We know that, of course, the Department of Environmental Conservation, but also the Department of Transportation, many different state agencies make decisions all the time that impact climate and equity. And it creates these screens so that they're actually taking that into account when they're making these decisions.
New York State is pretty far from meeting the goals of this historic act. So my question is, in order for us to meet these goals, it needs to be funded and there needs to be accountability.
Yeah, we passed the CLCPA, the climate law, in 2019. And since then, we have not had significant funding for the law. And we know that without significant state investment, we will not reach the goals set out. And these are legally mandated goals. These are not ambitions. These are things that the state is legally responsible for meeting. We've done a number of studies with, the University of Massachusetts, and the state did their own study. NYSERDA did their own study that said that there needs to be $10 billion in investment to meet these goals. And we are nowhere near that.
Can you give us an overview of the Climate Jobs and Justice Package?
The Climate Jobs and Justice Package is really a roadmap to rapidly decarbonize New York, make our state healthier and more equitable, ensure a just transition for workers, and help create an accessible green economy for all. There are 3 buckets of the Climate Jobs and Justice Package. The first is to fully fund and implement New York's climate law. The second is to build renewable energy for all and create good green union jobs. And the third is to make polluters and the ultra-rich pay what they owe. So one of the big pieces of the Climate Jobs and Justice Package is what we're calling the Climate and Community Protection Fund. And the Climate and Community Protection Fund would specifically look to create a fund within the government that's actually modeled after the existing Environmental Protection Fund. And it would create programs to transition us off of fossil fuels and do it once again in a way that is prioritizing investments in the communities that are hit first and worst by the climate crisis, as well as making sure that the jobs that are created with all of this spending, which there are many, some estimates are 100,000 jobs over the next 10 years, permanent jobs, not temporary jobs. and that there are real good labor provisions. And we've developed these with our labor allies, both within the coalition and outside of the coalition. Really, the Climate Community Protection Fund is the way that we actually fund the CLCPA. And there's a question of, okay, well, where does that money come from? And that's another kind of broad plank of the package. So within that, we know we need to make polluters pay, and we need to make the ultra rich pay their fair share. Within that, there are actually three different bills that we're looking at. The first is the Climate Superfund Act. This looks at the 10 oil and gas companies that have been polluting the most over the past 20 years. These are the same companies that it has been documented have lied to us about the climate crisis, that knew about the climate crisis, that took the playbook of the tobacco industry to delay action. And it actually measures the amount of damage that they have done and makes them pay $30 billion as a whole and spend that money then over 10 years. So this is a tremendous amount of investment and would get us much closer to meeting our goals. But we also need to stop just giving them free money. That's where the Fossil Fuel Subsidy Elimination Act comes into play. It's a much smaller amount of money. It's about $300 million a year. But it's still a tremendous amount of money that we're really giving away to the fossil fuel industry while they continue to pollute and poison our communities. And then the third part of how we're going to pay for this is with working to tax the ultra rich. And so there's a group in New York called Invest in Our New York that has been developing and fighting for these provisions over the years. And so we're working directly with them to also push for this, because we know the ultra wealthy have a much, much higher carbon footprint, as well as the resources to really pay for this transition. And so between those three components, we really have the ability to fund this transition.
These three acts that you're trying to get through, is this part of the 2023 Climate Jobs and Justice package?
Exactly. So what I just talked about was the first part, fully funding the CLCPA, and then the third section, which is making polluters and the ultra-rich pay their fair share. And so there's actually a third large component of this package in addition to those two, which we call Build Renewable Energy for All and Create Good Green Union Jobs. This part of the package really looks at the programmatic side of things. We identified as a coalition 4 main priority bills that would really be like a game changer in getting the state to align its efforts towards the climate law. The first is the Build Public Renewables Act, which got pretty close to passing last year. It passed in the Senate, but was not able to pass in the Assembly. The basic idea of the Build Public Renewables Act, or as advocates often call it the BPRA, is allowing an existing authority, the New York Power Authority, to actually build and own renewable energy itself, which it's uniquely positioned to, given its ability to bond. And so in the areas where the private market is unable to create enough wind and solar, this would allow the New York Power Authority to step up and actually build that infrastructure. Then there's also the Gas Transition and Affordability Act. This is really looking at the gas system and looking at the Public Service Commission, which is probably the most powerful agency you've never heard of in New York State, which really looks at a lot of our energy system and our gas system, and it reforms it so that it's aligned with the climate law. Then the third piece is actually a new bill that we are currently drafting, and it's called the Climate Accountability Act. And that's specifically looking at NYSERDA. And NYSERDA is the agency within the state that is all things energy. And the point of the Climate Accountability Act is really to ensure all the equity portions in the climate law are being represented within NYSERDA and are being held, as well as really reforming the structure of NYSERDA itself to make sure that it's, once again, aligned with our climate law.
You talked about 4 bills that New York Renews is going to do. Could you share with us the 4th bill?
Yeah, the 4th bill in this second section of the package is the Blueprint Bill. And this is a really important bill, specifically looking at fossil fuel generating power plants. And it means that we actually come up with a plan for replacement and redevelopment of these fossil fuel infrastructure sites. And this is particularly important for environmental justice communities where so many of these power plants are. It not only looks at how are we going to shut down these power plants, but how are we also going to repurpose them and ensure that the workers that are on these power plants have a just transition.
All of these bills are so important, and there's components to it that you've explained. Why so many bills?
Two answers. The first is we need to transition every single sector of our economy. And to do that, there are so many different parts of it that we need to be looking at, whether it's buildings, the gas system, the electricity system. All of this is included in the Climate Jobs and Justice package. And the other thing is, last year and the year before, we were pushing a piece of legislation that was one bill. And it was, what we call an omnibus bill. And what we found was that politically, a bill of that size is much harder to move compared to looking at the different components. And the Climate and Community Protection Fund really takes actually the spending plan from the old piece of legislation and it puts it into this new fund. And so much of that hard work and the thinking that went into that is included in our new package as well.
I wanted to ask about something that you talked about with NYSERDA earlier in our conversation about how they did a study on the energy infrastructure in New York State. Can you just briefly restate their findings? Because if we're looking to have them be more accountable as well as change their structure within, it's a good thing that they did this study, and their very own study shows that the way that it's functioning now is not within the New York State climate law.
Yeah, so the study that I mentioned earlier is specifically looking at how much money do we need for this transition. And that study shows that we need at least $10 billion of investments. The study that came out of the Perry Institute of University of Massachusetts showed we need probably $30 billion a year in investment. So it's a pretty wide range, but the bottom line is we need a lot more investment than we currently have. And even NYSERDA has an understanding of that. And within the Climate Action Council process that I mentioned earlier, they did a number of analyses, including finding that the costs of the transition are actually going to be a lot less than the benefits of the transition. So doing this transition will actually save New York a lot of money, particularly because of the public health impacts of electrifying our entire infrastructure.
I have some family and friends that believe that we're asking too much for too much money, and they're worried about the economy. So if you were to make a couple of sentences to the naysayers that all of this money that is needed to mitigate the climate crisis is not good for our economy, what would you say?
Well, that narrative is the oldest trick in the book from the industry. And I think the first thing is I would just look at who's saying that, because the fossil fuel industry is definitely saying that. And the Business Council is definitely saying that. But study after study is showing that we will actually save so much money with this transition. And there are very few fossil fuel jobs in New York State relative to the amount of green energy jobs that will be created. Once again, the job studies in New York and really across the country show that there are a lot of jobs to be created from this transition. That also means, of course, that we can't leave the workers behind that are going to be left out of this transition. And so there's a lot of the money in the Climate Community Protection Fund is specifically looking at that and creating a worker insurance fund. But really, the idea that it's the environment versus the economy is the classic industry talking point that is really not reflected in reality or in any of the studies that people that are way smarter than I have done. The other thing I'll just say on that is The new form of climate denial is climate delay. Throughout this entire process around the Climate Action Council, we've seen groups like Con Ed and natural gas or the upstate fossil fuel utilities saying, we support the goals of the CLCPA, but hold on, this is going too fast. Or hold on, there are other solutions that will allow us to magically keep all of our fossil fuel infrastructure, but just run it on different sources. And at New York Renews, we call these false solutions because it's clear that that isn't true, and that to just say, oh, we should keep the status quo and we need to do more studies and really make sure we're not going too far into this. Like, we have been doing all of that. And it is so clear at this point that we need to move forward rapidly if we want to have any chance. And every single year that we wait, the costs are actually increasing.
I also want to ask you about the wins that we've had towards meeting the goals of New York's historic climate law.
Some of the biggest wins I think that we've seen are the rejection of new fossil fuel infrastructure that would go against the New York climate law. The Williams Pipeline, which incredible mixture of groups across the city and in New Jersey were really fighting against, was ultimately rejected. And one of the big reasons that was cited was that it was not compliant with the CLCPA. There have been other power plants like the power plant in Astoria, which permit was denied, and environmental justice community also cited for the CLCPA. And there have been other fossil fuel infrastructure fights around the state as well.
I want to go back to the green jobs and how that is good for the environment. It's good for the people, and it's good for our economy. Can you speak more about green jobs?
So we always say we're a climate, jobs, and justice coalition. And it's really, you need all three legs of the stool to really bring together the coalition that can pass this. And part of that is because there is so much both economic and political potential in creating these jobs. This is going to be a massive, massive boon to our economy in New York. Right now, we spend billions of dollars every year on fossil fuels that are coming from outside of the state. We could be spending that money on creating energy here in New York and actually employing people to create that energy, maintain that energy, but also do things like retrofit our homes. So many of these jobs are going to be because we're going to need to retrofit almost every single home in this entire state. And that's a lot of work. And that's a lot of work that folks are already trained to do and that we can train more people to do. And it's also work that really helps people save money. There are places, especially in upstate New York, where people are paying more money in the winter for their heating bills than they are on their rent. And so this is the kind of investment that not only helps build jobs, but actually strengthens our communities. Unlike, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, to get fracked gas from Pennsylvania, hurt Pennsylvania, the people of Pennsylvania, the landscape of Pennsylvania, and then also, of course, have to pay for that money and put our money out of state.
How are we going to transition the workers in the fossil fuel industry into green jobs?
The thing that we've learned in New York and in other states is that there is no silver bullet. Sometimes people talk like, we'll just teach coding to the coal miners, but that's unrealistic. And so we take a much more systematic approach within this. And so we look at both providing direct financial assistance to workers, job training, but also looking at the communities that are dependent on taxes from fossil fuels. So, for example, if there is a school district that relies on taxes from a power plant, there's actually money within the Climate and Community Protection Fund that could go to that district to make up for some of that lost revenue. We've really worked hard to incorporate all of the different changes in just transition policy over the years into this package. So we really have the gold standard of worker and community protection, within the Climate Community Protection Fund.
What can we do to ensure that the ambitious goals of New York State's Climate Act stays on track?
The first thing is really to push really hard for the climate jobs and justice package. We can do that in a number of ways. If you're not affiliated with an organization, the first step is always to join an organization that is fighting for climate justice, especially here in New York State. And on our website, we actually have a map of all of our coalition members, including 350 Brooklyn.
All 320 of them.
All 320 of them. And so you can take a look, and there's contact information there to really join the coalition members.
And they're throughout the whole state.
They're all across the state. We say from Buffalo to Brentwood.
Yep.
And then the other thing is really to just engage in the legislative process here in New York State. Sometimes engaging in the process nationally can be both really frustrating with the gridlock as well as can feel so far away from home. But the amount of people that can come together and make a real impact here in New York State is much lower and is really powerful. And so I really urge folks to read about the Climate Jobs and Justice Package and think about what are the changes that this could have in my community, and then, reach out to your representatives and reach out to your fellow community members to start having these conversations to build that longer term power towards passing this package. So
what is your website so that people can take a look at your list of 320 organizations?
It's www.nyrenews.org.
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about that we missed?
I know so many people who have, what we're calling climate anxiety these days. And the number one thing that really alleviates that is actually fighting to make concrete changes against the climate crisis and fighting for the world that we want to live in. And joining a group of people who feel that way like you do isn't just a good thing for our planet and for our communities. It's actually can be a really transformational and beautiful experience. And I know that I've experienced that. And so I would just say doing this with other people is the key to doing this also for a long time, because this is going to be the fight of our entire lives.
Xaver, you are wonderful to talk with about how we're going to transition and the work that New York Renews is doing in coalition with everyone. It's empowering. It's going to help us move forward. And I just want to thank you and all of your team for the work that you're doing.
Thank you very much for having me and for all the work that you and 350 Brooklyn are doing.
That's it for this episode of Climate Check, Stories and Solutions. Thanks for listening. To subscribe, go to climatecheck.fm. Climate Check is a production of the Climate Idea Exchange of 350 Brooklyn and Brooklyn, New York. Stay up to date with our releases by following 350 Brooklyn on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Our production team is Alyssa Kropp, Barbara Schroeder, Bryn Fuller-Becker, that's me, Peter Kamali, Claire Schertz, Phoebe Miller, and Michael Dondero. The music you heard in this episode is from Blue Dot Sessions. 350 Brooklyn is a local affiliate of 350.org, a worldwide grassroots climate organization. Join us in finding solutions to counter climate change.